Hello and welcome. My spirit name is Akasha and my birth name is Michelle Taff. So I wanted to talk today to you about freedom and how important that is in both your personal life and in your wider life as a member of a society. How important it is to be able to freely express yourself as a member of a democratic society. So given what is currently happening in many countries in the world, where freedoms are being eroded every day, such as starting with the freedom of expression and then moving along the spectrum to freedom of over bodily autonomy, so freedom to choose what you do with your own body. These freedoms are being taken away as we speak in many countries in the world. And at the same time, there is a lot of protest and a lot of civil unrest as a response to the slow dissolving of human rights and freedoms in many countries. So I wanted just to compare with you, so the relationships that you have in your personal life, so personal level relationships, compared with the relationship you have with a government, with your government. So everything in life, I believe, is about relationship. We have a relationship first with ourselves. We have a relationship with our families. We have a relationship with our societies. We have a relationship with our actual country. And all of these relationships are fluid at all times. They're all things that we need to negotiate all of the time. And if we look at the definition of a healthy relationship compared with an unhealthy relationship, so at a personal level, for example, in a couple relationship, a healthy relationship would be a relationship where both people are fairly strongly grounded in themselves. Both people feel a sense of their own agency and their own power as humans to decide and think for themselves. And together they support each other in a loving way, which helps both of those people in that relationship to evolve and grow as a human being. And this really, it's the point of all relationships, and it's also the goal of human life. It's evolution. Everybody's path, trajectory in life is towards the evolution of their soul. So you might call this self-realization or self-actualization. So a relationship which is healthy is one which supports your self-realization process, which supports your self-actualization process, which supports you living out your goals and dreams in this life and becoming the person that you want to become. So what about an unhealthy relationship? So an unhealthy relationship is, or might be called an abusive relationship, is a relationship where one party is controlling and manipulating the other party. So one party has a power level up here, for example, and the other party is down here, and this party is dominating, controlling, manipulating the other party. So this is also can be seen as narcissistic abuse. This person is concerned with what they want mainly, and they're not really concerned with the other party in that relationship. And so they exert powers of control and domination and coercion on the other party. So this is an abusive or an unhealthy relationship. And just to make it really clear, what goes on in an unhealthy and abusive relationship, it's a process where one person, generally the abusive person, is not willing or able to face up to their own darkness, their own shadow, the shadow sides of their personality. So that might be their own feeling of lack of self-worth, their own lack of self-acceptance, lack of self-love, and the rage that might come from that. And as a result of denying their shadow, denying and not looking at those parts of themselves, they will then project out the shadow parts of their personality, that being the lack of self-worth, the lack of self-belief, the perhaps hatred turns toward the self. They'll project this out onto another person. So onto that person in that manipulative, dominating relationship. And then if that other person protests and calls out the behavior of the abusive person for what it is, it's domination, it's control, it's coercion, and this can be emotional domination, control, coercion, can be financial domination or control or coercion, and can also, in extreme cases, turn into physical domination and control and coercion. And so if the person that's being treated in this way calls this behavior out and names it for what it is, then the dominating or the narcissistic person has a few different tactics at their disposal. So one of these tactics is gaslighting. Gaslighting is when you manipulate someone by psychological means into doubting their own sanity. So you basically, somebody will stand up and explain how they feel and what is their understanding of your behavior. And if you are gaslighting them, then instead of addressing your own part in that interaction, your own behavior, instead of being mature enough to own and to see that, you instead just throw the spotlight back on them, and you say that perhaps they are not well because they're not seeing the situation clearly. They're not, they don't see what is really happening. So you cast aspersions on that person's vision or view of reality. And an extreme end of that is you suggest that maybe they are mentally unwell, mentally ill. So this is a really common tactic used in abusive relationships, and consciously or unconsciously, the tactic is used by the abusive party in order to not look at their own part in that relationship, in order to avoid basically looking at themselves and avoid looking at their shadow, avoid looking at the dark side of their personality. So I wanted to then just look at this dynamic, this abusive relationship dynamic, in terms of a relationship that we have with a state. So if a state is, or a government is starting to manipulate us, to use an excess of control, an excess of power to control how we behave. So using tactics such as police repression, such as fines, to control people's response to government dictates or directives or mandates, to quash any dissent amongst the population to the dictates or the mandates or the orders of the government. Then the government is then entering into an abusive relationship with their people, with the population, because instead of that relationship being a mutually supportive relationship where both parties are supporting the growth and the evolution of the other party, so in this case where a government is in place really in order to create the conditions, create and sustain the conditions for the flourishing of the populace who they serve. So this is the role of a healthy government. A healthy government creates, builds and sustains the condition for a flourishing of the populace, and they create conditions where the individuals in that society are able to go through that life journey and that self-realization, that self-actualization process, and they're able to reach their goals and make their dreams come true. And in turn, if that is a healthy relationship where the government is providing the economic, the democratic, the educational means, the social means for this person to thrive and for this person to actualize themselves, then in return, that member of that society will generally feel well disposed towards their government. They will generally feel that they also want to play their part in supporting that society of which they are a part, through paying taxes, through being actively involved in community building, through giving of their gifts to others in whatever is their way of doing that, through their work, through their hobbies, through their interactions with that society. So it's a balanced relationship where there is mutual respect and a relatively balanced level of give and take. So that's a healthy relationship between a citizen and their government, well, let's say. So in an unhealthy relationship between a citizen and their government, then instead of there being mutual respect, and instead of both of these parties being in a healthy relationship to power, then instead of this, the government starts to become drunk on their own sense of authority and their own sense of power and control, and starts to overstep the boundaries of the natural boundaries and limits on good governance, so that overstepping the boundaries of respect of the democratic rights and freedoms of their population. And usually there is an agenda behind this. There is a reason why they are overstepping these boundaries and why they are starting to become more dictatorial in their attitude towards the populace. So what happens when this kind of attitude starts to flourish in a society? You will see greater levels of coercion, manipulation, and authoritarianism start to develop in these societies, because the balance in this relationship has become skewed, and the power has become to the power of the government towards their people has become, instead of a mutually supportive and beneficial relationship, it becomes more of a dictatorial relationship, where they see their role as more of controlling the citizens rather than supporting their growth and development. And the results of this kind of attitude will be repression of free speech, repression of free movement, repression of every aspect of people's lives within that society, the subjects of that society. So I wanted just to share with you a few of my own experiences visiting societies where there either was not, at the time I visited, freedom of expression and many different levels of freedom, or where in previous times there was not. And just as a way to invite some reflection around what is currently going on in the world, and look back to history to see what are the end results when a government starts to overreach in its powers and starts to become dictatorial and authoritarian. So first one I want to look at is Cuba. So I visited Cuba in 2006 when Fidel Castro was still alive. I was really determined to get there while he was still alive, because I was interested to see what this socialist republic was like in person. So the Cuban Revolution was in 1959, and I arrived there in Cuba in 2006. So that is 41, 47, nearly 50 years of the socialist republic in Cuba. And as I said, Fidel was still alive at that time. So my personal experience there was I encountered a really vibrant people in Cuba, really full of life and full of art and music. There was a beautiful feeling of aliveness and vibrance there. In Havana, when I arrived, there were street performers who were, I was told, they were actually, that was their job. They were paid by the state to be artists and performers out in the street, entertaining both the local people and the tourists and travelers like me. So I was really impressed by their level of artisanship, by the level of musicianship. There were many people dressed up in fantastic costumes, walking on stilts, circus kind of displays, and there were amazing walking bands as well of musicians and singers singing, playing traditional Cuban music. So this to me seemed pretty impressive, that there was a state job for these people, that their artistic expression and that artists were supported. And actually I did speak to some of those performers, and they told me that actually in Cuba at that time, 2006, they received much more money than most other Cubans, like for example doctors or teachers, because as well as their state salary, they got abundant tips from the tourists and the visitors to Cuba, the people that there in Havana. There are a lot of international tourists, so people that had enough money to give good tips to these artists and performers. So they were pretty happy with that situation. But then I went out of Havana. I went to visit a town in the east side of Cuba called Viñales, a very beautiful town with these amazing mogotes, these beautiful big green hills that come out of the landscape just like this. And this was a very traditional kind of a beautiful pastoral vision of Cuba. So a small town where there were tobacco farmers and coffee farmers and lush vegetation. And in this town it was just a one street town, and every night as well there was music in 2 of the bars in the town and dancing. So that was awesome and really fun for me. But there I did speak to quite a few of the people in this town in Viñales, and I speak Spanish, so I could very easily communicate with the people there. So the reality of their lives was that quite a few of the young people I spoke to did want to leave Cuba. Even though they all had jobs, they earned hardly any money, and they didn't see themselves as free in any way, and they wanted to leave via a boat to Miami. And I spoke to some older people, asking them how they felt also about the regime and about the revolution. And most people would not speak to me openly about it. So they would either just not reply, or they would say that they would have to whisper and they would take me to a faraway place where they would not be overheard by the neighbors, because if the neighbors heard them in any way speaking against the regime, then this would be dangerous for them. So Cuba is famous for having many political dissidents in jail over this whole period of the regime, and they've also executed many people that speak against the Cuban regime, the regime of Castro at that time. So it was understandable to me that people didn't want to speak openly about that, but I never actually experienced a place where there was palpable fear in the environment. So even though it was like a tropical paradise on the outside, on the internal level, the internal lives of the people, they didn't feel free, and they were fearful to express their views, and really they were not free to express themselves, even with their friends and neighbors and with foreigners like me. So this sort of put a bit of another spin on my experience, and was like quite a dark shadow over my vision or my understanding of what really was the reality of the Cuban people. They were not free. They were not able to express themselves openly. They were not, most of them, able to earn enough money to visit any other countries. And even if they could, they were actually prisoners in Cuba. Most people were prevented from leaving Cuba by the Cuban government. So that was the reality of my experience there, and very clearly I could see that even though it looked like a beautiful place to live, I definitely would not have been interested in living under a regime where I was not able to speak my mind, where I was not able to leave, and where I wasn't able to freely earn the money that I might have wanted to realize different goals and dreams in my life. So another country I visited in 2016 was Romania. And I went to Romania and stayed at a very beautiful yoga retreat in the mountains of Transylvania, just near the castle in Brasov, or nearby Brasov, which is the inspiration for the novel Count Dracula. So Romania was also under a communist regime for about 40 years, from the 1960s until the revolution in 1989, which overthrew the dictator Ceausescu. So my impression of Romania at that time was a very beautiful country, but quite backwards, economically speaking, although in some way it did seem like there was still kind of a level of authenticity in the villages, in the way of life that people lived in the mountains where I was in Transylvania. Just a really quite a beautiful simplicity to the way that they lived. They grew their own food. They actually drove in horse and carts, the farmers, down from the mountains to the markets to sell their produce. And in a way that seemed quite beautiful to me. But as I was hitchhiking from Brasov down to Bucharest, the capital, the people that picked me up pointed out along the journey, so about 2/3 of the way down into Bucharest, they pointed to a small town where they explained to me that Ceausescu, the dictator, and his wife were executed there in 1989 on Christmas Day, so just after the Romanian Revolution, which basically got rid of the regime of Ceausescu. So Ceausescu also, like Fidel Castro, had a vision of a utopian society, and he also had a vision of Romania as a world's power. So a part of his vision of building Romania into a world power was that he one of the many things that he did to support this vision and this program was that he made abortion illegal, and he basically made a decree in the late 1960s, just here, so a law, Decree 770, which was a law prohibiting contraception and abortion. And Romanian women were then subject to compulsory monthly examinations by state doctors who were checking that they were not going to miscarry, and they were then also interrogated about their personal and their sexual life. So this was a part of Ceausescu's vision to populate Romania. He wanted to bring a whole lot more people into the country through this regime of trying to force Romanian women to have many babies. And as a result of this, as you might remember, there were overflowing orphanages in Romania. And around the time of the revolution, it was discovered when Western NGOs went in to support the transition of Romania from communist dictatorship to a democracy. They found these orphanages filled to the brim with unwanted, abandoned children, which was the direct result of this policy of promoting the birth rate and forcing women to have children against their wishes. The result was these filled up orphanages where children were really mistreated because there just wasn't enough people or resources to look after them. So they were hundreds of children under the care of just a few staff, and they were malnourished. They were not given the emotional attention that every child requires. And so this resulted in a whole generation of traumatized children. So Ceausescu had been repressing his population for the 40 years of his rule. And finally, in 1989, when the people could not take this level of control and coercion anymore, and they revolted, they started to protest. Those protests spread all over Romania, and that ended up in a huge protest in the center of Bucharest, where the Romanian Revolution took place. So again, this is a relationship between a government and the populace, where the control ratchets up so high that people's lives are also completely dominated and repressed and restricted by the governing regime. And to the extent where, the same as in Cuba, people were routinely arrested, jailed, and killed also for opposing the regime. So, last country I just want to mention here in this investigation of our power relationships is Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. So I also visited Cambodia in 2019 for the first time. And the first thing I did in Cambodia when I landed in Phnom Penh was to go out and see the museum that's been erected to the as a memory of all the people that were killed by the regime of Pol Pot. So Pol Pot was a communist leader, so leader of the Khmer Rouge, who came to power in the 1970s, and he had a vision of utopia. So again, he had a personal life goal and a vision. So his personal self-realization process, same like that of Fidel Castro and Nicolae Ceausescu, involved a grandiose vision of his country and what he wanted it to become. And his vision was seeing that Cambodia become an agrarian utopia. And this idea was a kind of a return to innocence. And he was apparently inspired by what happened in France after the French Revolution. So he was educated, him and his co-communist comrades in the higher echelons of power in his Khmer Rouge were educated in France, and he was inspired by what happened in the Reign of Terror after the French Revolution, so around 1793, after the kings and queens in France had been deposed by the revolution. There was a kind of a reign of terror where they started from year zero. Robespierre was in control, and they had their agenda that they were pushing, the new agenda, which was for the new French Republic, starting at year zero in 1793. And part of that was getting rid of anybody opposing that new agenda. So Pol Pot was inspired by this to create an agrarian utopia in Cambodia. And what he did was basically shipped people from the cities, forced people to leave the cities in Cambodia, to leave Phnom Penh and all the big cities, and to move out into the countryside and become farmers. And anybody who was an intellectual, so like an academic or a teacher, anyone who spoke a foreign language, anybody who wore glasses, they were immediately seen as enemies of this new regime, enemies of the new utopia, and they were executed. So between 1975 and 1978, there was an estimated 2 million Cambodian people who died by execution, forced labor, or famine. So I went to this Killing Fields Museum just out of Phnom Penh, about a 10-minute drive. And this is a place where thousands and thousands of Cambodians who were seen as dissidents or against the regime. They were just bussed in here from the capital, and they were executed and buried in that all this land around this museum, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So this is what happens when power gets completely, where the power relationship is completely out of control, and where freedoms are taken away from people forcibly to the extent where they have no agency left in their society. So just like in an abusive relationship, in a very abusive relationship, physically abusive relationship, the end point of that relationship can be the abuser killing the abused person. In an abusive relationship between a government and a people, where the people have lost all of their rights, human rights, rights to express themselves, rights to move, rights to work, then this the same process can take place. So the government takes the place of the abuser in that relationship and starts to kill people who are against the regime. So just wanted to use these three states examples as just a way to get some perspective on what actually happens and what has happened just in these three countries, but in many, many, many other countries all around the world, when governments take too much power and start to take away, restrict the rights of their citizens. And of course, in some of these cases too, for example, in Cuba, there were a lot of improvements for the Cuban people as well under Castro's regime. So every Cuban person had a house that I met. Nobody had any mortgages. There was universal healthcare. There was universal education. So it was not all destruction and repression. There were a lot of good points, at least in Cuba. In Cambodia, I think it's quite a different phenomenon, and Romania as well. From what I can see, it doesn't look like there was a big. Doesn't look like the benefits for the Romanian people under Ceausescu's regime were that great. But in Cuba, I could see also the upside of the socialist policies of the government. But I think it's never justified to take away freedom of speech, to squash opposition, and it's never right or defensible to arrest people for speaking their mind. As soon as you do that, you are no longer free, and you're no longer in a healthy relationship with the people of that country. It's abuse, and abuse never ends well. So just something to think about today, something to maybe help you to reflect on what is important to you in what's happening in the world right now, with governments increasingly moving to control their populace, to repress people's right to protest and demonstrate, to stop people's free movement around the country. So this is just to give you some perspective on what happens when that's taken to a really an extreme, to help you to perhaps reflect on your response to what might be happening in your country right now and how you feel about it. So what to do when you find yourself in this kind of a dynamic. So the same thing you would do if you find yourself in this dynamic in a personal relationship. Trust your instincts. So trust yourself, trust your own feelings, trust your gut instincts. If you feel that something is not right, that something that you are being told to do by your government, you're being mandated or ordered or dictated to do, if you feel it's not right, that probably means it's not right. So trust your instincts. If you feel you're being bullied, it probably means that you're being bullied. Trust your instincts. And if you are afraid to stand up for yourself, then that's a normal reaction to anyone. For anyone who's being bullied, understand that it's completely normal and understandable. But what happens if you allow bullies to bully you is they will keep bullying, and the bullying doesn't stop until you call it out. So this is the invitation of any abusive relationship, whether it's on a personal level or whether it's on a level with your society, your government. The invitation for you is, okay, I can either see myself as a victim in this situation and I can go into fear and contraction and hiding, and that path, as you can imagine, it doesn't really lead anywhere except to more fear, more contraction, more hiding. Or I can see myself as an agent who's entered into this relationship, and I can call out what is going on, and I can say that the terms and conditions of this relationship are not working for me anymore. And if somebody has one party has taken far too much power and they feel it's their right to treat me in any way, shape or form, which, for example, takes away my basic rights to live, move, breathe and express myself, then that's where you have the opportunity to stand up for yourself, stand up for your rights as a human to breathe, to live, to move, to work, to circulate, to travel, to leave your country. Stand up for your rights to realize yourself as is your right as a human being born on earth. No government has the right to intervene in your process of your soul's growth, in terms of your process of realizing yourself and realizing your goals and dreams. You have the right to stand up for that and to defend that and to defend your right to live your life. Just as you have the right to do that in an intimate relationship, in a one-on-one relationship where somebody is abusing you and over time has really stripped you of your self-worth, your self-esteem and your well-being, you have the right to stand up and call that out for what it is. So that's my invitation for you today. Follow your gut instinct, trust yourself, know your rights, stand up for them, and stand up for your friends and your neighbors. So thank you for listening. I hope this has been useful for you and helpful, and given you another perspective on what's going on in the world as a result of this COVID virus. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.